The Lockdown is a Psyop by Andy Nowicki, Part 1, A Contrived Crisis. This can be found at lockdownpsyop.blogspot.com. It's something I wrote several months ago and that I'm re-recording since my original YouTube page was nuked by YouTube. Part 1, A Contrived Crisis. 5 years ago, I published Conspiracy, Compliance, Control, and Defiance. In that extended essay, I put forward my observations regarding the psychology of those who set out to arrogate to themselves dominion over the rest of the population. I attempted to make distinctions between what is commonly known as the sociopath, the sort of person bereft of conscience but also not typically possessed of excessive ambition, and the superficially similar type that I called the reptilian, whose absence of moral scruples is matched by a boundless desire for power and control over his fellow man. In using the term reptilian, I sought simple metaphorical verisimilitude. I did not intend to propose that those belonging to what I called the reptilian ruling class actually possessed any non-human DNA. Instead, they were, like reptiles, cold-blooded, with no capacity for empathy, compassion, guilt, shame, or other traits generally regarded as redeemably human. Though the reptilian comparison was metaphorical, it was by no means intended to be hyperbolic. I still find it thoroughly apt, though I regret that in some cases it lent itself to misunderstanding among many who took me as being literal, i.e., of claiming that these reptilians were actual reptiles, or so-called lizard people. Nevertheless, I have little desire to scrutinize these truly appalling creatures, be they literally reptilian, literally mammalian, or literally otherwise, anymore. What I wrote of this murderous claque in 2015 is, I find, just as true of them in 2020. Still, in light of the extraordinary events that have befallen much of our world in March and April of the current year, with an utterly unprecedented and obscenely absurd imposition of a lockdown being imposed upon billions of human beings on the flimsiest of pretexts, I find that I must return to the subject again in order to provide a sort of addendum to what was covered in that earlier essay. It is my position that Lockdown 2020 has been a largely contrived and fabricated event. I do not reach this conclusion lightly or frivolously, but upon careful and thoughtful consideration of the circumstances at hand. It is further my assertion that, like 9/11, Sandy Hook, and other heavily hyped, much discussed, and avidly sensationalized high-profile disasters and tragedies, the COVID-19 pandemic is being shamelessly exploited by our reptilian rulers in order to achieve cold-bloodedly nefarious ends. Reckoning with the panoply of motivations likely involved in this operation is, however, beyond the scope of this treatise. Other inquiring minds possessed of independent, non-compliant spirits are already hard at work unearthing the infernal nature of the enterprise, which finally devolves, one gathers, into some naked power grab of mammoth proportions. What I aim to examine here is not the various dimensions of the why, so much as the numerous iterations of the how. It is my thesis that, like the notorious top-secret MK Ultra project, which sought to produce mind slavery through the intentional imposition of trauma upon human beings, who in many cases never consented to being victims of such inhuman experimentation, so in a broader sense, humanity is now being intentionally subjected to trauma in order to create in them what could be called a state of mass compliance, through which they can be manipulated into accepting greater and greater outrages being perpetrated against their lives and liberties, all for the stated purpose of promoting their ostensible well-being. A warning before proceeding further. If you are of the opinion that those who have almost uniformly imposed patently draconian restrictions upon much of the world's population, in some cases essentially amounting to placing innocent people under indefinite house arrest, have enacted these measures out of a genuine concern for public health and safety, then you will not find what I have to argue here to be at all palatable. If, however, you can at least conceive of the possibility that these supposedly appointed, or in so many cases self-appointed, to your guardianship, may in fact have more interest in power and control than in providing earnest shepherdry to their appointed, or self-appointed, flock, then read on, while of course exercising appropriate discernment and careful consideration. Finally, a disclaimer of sorts. I do not trumpet myself as one possessed of any sort of technical expertise, only as a careful observer of human behavior, a fierce hater of totalitarianism, a tireless chronicler of rhetorical flimflammery, and a ceaseless combater of intellectual dishonesty. I claim these and no academic degree or other mark of status as my bona fides. To these ideals alone do I here aspire. The reader alone may judge the extent to which I may finally have succeeded or failed. We must first admit that the perpetrators of this highly contrived crisis are in a sense beyond ideology. In another sense, of course, they are anything but non-ideological, but I shall come to this seeming paradox presently. That is to say, they hail from ideologies across the ostensible spectrum. The crisis has been cited as grounds for a lockdown by left-wing governments and right-wing governments alike, with total consent granted by democratic republics, parliamentary monarchies, military dictatorships, theocratic juntas, and every other conceivable form of rule. The uniformity of this imposition across much of the globe, with only a few exceptions here or there, should give the thoughtful observer immediate pause. How often have we seen the controlling regimes of the various nations of the world marching in this type of lockstep in their shared push to impose a lockdown on their citizenry/subjects? All regimes enforcing these conditions have acted ostensibly under the auspices of, quote, emergency powers, unquote, a phrase which contains within itself a multitude of rhetorical mischief. In nearly every case, the presumption of such powers is constitutionally dubious, if not outright prohibitive, at least among countries which observe, however nominally, a constitutional form of governance. Rights, after all, such as those famously codified in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, are not meant to be viewed as merely conditionally allowed, excepting the manifestation of some intervening emergency. Instead, such rights are fundamentally asserted as existing absolutely, regardless of changing conditions or circumstances, even circumstances designated as emergencies. These disparately oriented regimes have acted in collectively repressive lockstep. Their shared tyranny takes more severe form in certain cases than in others, but in all cases amounts to the forceful closure of businesses deemed unessential, a term which introduces the slippery slope fallacy by the very arbitrariness of its undeniable connotative ramifications. For just what is essential, pray tell? I have observed some odd notions that can at the very least be called counterintuitive on this front, such as bookstores closing up shop while liquor stores remain open for business. So, booze is essential, but books aren't. And some states have even forbidden the selling of seeds, enabling people to grow vegetables or fruits in their backyards. Since when is the quest to become more self-sufficient during a time of crisis an inessential activity? In fact, such conditions now endure in certain places, God grant it be not much longer, that citizens/subjects are likewise demanded to refrain from non-essential activities. Again, though, what is essential? To live healthily, a person should be able to exercise. He should have access to nature and the outdoors. One would think it perfectly reasonable to claim such activities as essential. Yet in many places across the country and the world right now, such healthy behavior is either forbidden or severely curtailed by the ruling authorities. Instead, people are required to remain cooped up inside, with only a few exemptions granted for absolutely necessary occasions. Wilderness areas such as public parks are now shut down in many regions. Basketball hoops and tennis nets have been removed to prevent unwanted indulgence in outdoor activities by irresponsible miscreants. Meanwhile, in some locales, drones are even dispatched to harry and harass solitary journeyers on country paths. Hefty fines are dispatched to nefarious dog walkers or incorrigible young parents with the temerity to take their kids out for a stroll and play catch in an open field. In all of these cases, both in the forced shuttering of thousands of, quote, non-essential businesses and in the sudden mass enforcement of house arrest of millions of law-abiding people, we see a certain cognitive dissonance being rendered manifest. Things have been determinedly and deliberately turned upside down. Nonsense now parades about as common sense, like a streetwalker gussied up in finery and expensive perfume. Not even language is safe. Quarantine, up until very recently, meant restricting the movement of the sick in order to prevent a contagion from spreading. Now the term has been sinisterly repurposed to mean the act of isolating everyone from everyone else. In the lockdown paradigm, those quarantined are not the sick, but the well. Why are the healthy being forced into isolation? We are told that the only way to protect everyone is, as one newsreader was heard to put it, to act like you already have the virus. So the healthy are automatically treated as if they were already sick. If there is truly a contagious virus about, one is indeed well advised to take prudent and reasonable precautions. However, in the contemporary lockdown paradigm, prudency and reason are translated into their opposites, namely panic promotion, fear-mongering, and trauma inducement. Radical, unprecedented, and utterly unconstitutional mandates, such as those which prevail under the lockdown paradigm, are sold as moderate and soberly conceived notions by experts who assure the population in soothing tones that they certainly know what is best for the rest of us. Our leaders, meanwhile, recite, parrot, and promulgate ominous jargon like social distancing, soberly instructing us to stand 6 feet apart from one another. Why 6 feet exactly? Isn't it enough to keep a wide berth and avoid contact when necessary? All while giving press conferences in which they stand cheek by jowl with one another on a narrow stage. Meanwhile, vast construction projects for major corporate organizations continue to be pursued. Look out your car window sometime and you will likely see them taking shape in your town. A new Chase Bank, another high-rise apartment complex, an add-on to your local Walmart or McDonald's, etc., with construction workers and builders standing in very close proximity to one another. Are these projects, invariably involving high-level corporations and influential and well-placed organizations, truly essential? Such questions never seem to get asked, and the cognitive dissonance mounts. The wearing of masks is first discouraged, then encouraged, and finally in some places becomes mandatory, with no explanation given for the shift in policy. And concerns about the economic well-being of those who live paycheck to paycheck, that is to say, most of the population, but who must now forego receiving paychecks indefinitely, are haughtily dismissed as if they were a matter of no consequence. Lower-waged working people are sanctimoniously lectured to stay home and sit idle while their livelihoods dissipate. And if they complain about this perilous set of circumstances, or protest for an end to the lockdown or a reopening of the economy, they are attacked by the lapdog media as virus deniers or some such. News organs, ostensibly the Fourth Estate, who pride themselves on their supposed eagerness to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, never seem actually to deign to advocate for the well-being of those who actually struggle, such as the people spoken of above, who desperately seek economic relief. Instead, they grotesquely fawn over the powerful. Paunchy Billy Sixpack, holding up a sign at an anti-lockdown rally, gets mocked, derided, and impugned, while profit-minded vaccine peddler, unrepentant child maimer, unscrupulous tycoon and pedophile befriender Bill Gates receives unending praise, laud, and plaudits. Thus, in a perverse inversion, are the afflicted further afflicted, while the comfortable are granted even greater degrees of supremely unearned comfort. Most appallingly, our would-be leaders and their media facilitators and enablers foment cognitive dissonance by telling bold-faced lies about the supposed source of the crisis, that is, the virus itself.